Ursula, it's great to see you.
Good to see you too.
Now, I always enjoy these in-between sessions. It gives us a chance to clean up what we didn't get to during the webinar.
Exactly. It's always so great to get to these additional questions. So the first one this month is, are China and India talking with Putin in hopes of persuading him against using nuclear weapons in Ukraine?
Okay. It has been reported that the leaders of both countries, particularly the leaders of China, have in fact been making that point to Putin. There's a lot of frustration among US leaders and the leaders of some of our allies that China and India are staying too close to Russia even during the war. And that is a point of understandable frustration. But the flip side of that decision is it may give them more inroads to talk to Putin on these types of topics. And if you remember, at the very beginning of the war, there was great concern that Putin might resort to tactical nuclear or biological weapons if the war was going poorly for Russia. Well, after a year, the war certainly is going poorly for Russia. And while there's never any way to know what the future holds, the fact that he hasn't resorted to such extreme measures could conceivably be because he's been hearing from sometimes allies like India and China that while they will support him in a measured way on a more conventional conflict, that a step up to that level would cause them to retract their support and line up instead with the US and the West.
Keeping on that theme, if China were to aid Russia militarily, at that point, how long do you think it would be until it turns into a global conflict?
Well, we have to hope that it never turns into a global conflict. And while the Chinese have already been providing what's known as dual use technology to Russia, that is technology that can be used, that's used primarily for civilian purposes, can be applied to military goals. The Chinese have refrained from more overt support of the Russian war effort. Right now, it appears that if anything, China might be heading in the opposite direction. President Xi is traveling to Moscow next week to meet with Putin. And after that, he has a call scheduled with President Zelensky from Ukraine. So it looks like rather than taking sides more aggressively with Russia, it looks like China is trying to position itself as a potential peacemaker in the region to illustrate a contrast between them and the United States, much as they've done it in the Middle East in the last several days with the agreement that they've brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So there's never any way to know for sure. And China and Russia have very close relationships in all sorts of ways. But at least at this moment, it looks like China believes that they would benefit more from being seen as the peacemaker rather than weighing in more overtly on Russia's behalf.
And finally, how does the Biden administration justify our present to China policy?
Well, it's a tricky line to walk. And for many years, US presidents of both parties, both Republican and Democrat, have walked a very careful line while on one hand articulating the US recognition of a so-called one China policy, which says in fact that Taiwan is a part of China. Throughout those years, through both Democratic and Republican administrations, the US has also maintained independent relationships with Taiwan that haven't ever quite risen to the formal level of diplomatic recognition. Now, there's an old saying in Washington that a gaffe is what happens when a politician tells the truth by accident. And on not one, not two, but on 3 occasions, President Biden, when asked about the possibility of a Chinese military incursion against Taiwan, Biden has made it clear that the US would intercede militarily on Taiwan's behalf. Now, that undermines the one China policy. And so in each of those occasions, either State Department or White House advisors have quote unquote clarified the president's statement to make sure that the Chinese understand and the rest of the world understands that despite our relationships with Taiwan, we still do see the island as a part of China. But after Biden said this 3 times, it's easy to understand why the Chinese might believe him. And after we've heard it 3 times, it'd be just as understandable for the rest of us to believe that Biden would intercede militarily on behalf of Taiwan. Now, would Donald Trump or Barack Obama or George W. Bush or Bill Clinton have done the same thing? In all likelihood, but they never said it out loud. And so, as I said earlier, it's a very uneasy line to walk between, on one hand, recognizing the one China policy, but also maintaining relationships with Taiwan. And Biden's public statements, on one hand, have brought some clarity to that seemingly inconsistent dual policy. But on the other hand, it has created another set of complications, which I would argue that, while accurate, have contributed to the growing tensions between the US and China right now.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Dan. And thank you to our audience for these excellent questions. And can't wait to be back next month when we talk about the Middle East.
Well, there's certainly no shortage of news coming out of the Middle East just over the last several days. So when you and I decided, Rachel, originally that this is where we wanted to turn our attention for April, I don't think we had any idea how much we'd have to talk about. But we'll do our best, and hopefully we'll be able to put together an interesting program. What do you think?
Definitely. I think it'll be great.
All right, listen. Have a great week, and I will look forward to seeing all of you at the beginning of April.